Ghost had obeyed Jake Morrison without question for 7 years, until the white horse refused to leave the old barn, and Jake discovered why. The terrified child hiding in the secret room between the walls was the only witness to a murder, and protecting her would force Jake to become the very thing he'd spent his career hunting. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Jake Morrison had owned Ghost for 7 years, and in all that time, the white gelding had never once disobeyed him. Not when they'd ridden through thunderstorms that split the Montana sky with lightning bright enough to blind. Not when they'd crossed swollen rivers where the current ran fast and deadly. Not even that terrible winter 3 years back, when Jake had pushed through a blizzard to reach old Mrs. Henderson's ranch, knowing she was alone and probably out of firewood. Ghost had carried him through all of it without hesitation, without question, trusting Jake's judgment even when his own animal instincts must have screamed at him to run the other way. But today, on this unseasonably warm November morning, Ghost had planted his hooves in the dirt outside the old barn at the edge of Jake's property and refused to move. The barn was a relic from another era, built by Jake's great-grandfather in 1887, when the Morrison family first claimed this stretch of land. The weathered gray boards had seen more than a century of Montana weather, and the structure leaned slightly to the east, as if tired from decades of standing against prairie winds. Jake had been meaning to tear it down for years now. The newer barn he'd built 5 years ago served all his needs, housing his other horses and equipment in a space that didn't threaten to collapse every time a strong wind blew through. This old barn was just taking up space, a liability waiting to happen. He'd finally made the decision last week. Today was supposed to be the day he'd start the demolition. But Ghost had other ideas. Jake had been leading the gelding past the old barn, heading toward the north pasture to check on the fence line, when Ghost suddenly stopped. Just stopped dead, his ears pricked forward, his whole body tense with an attention that Jake had learned over the years meant something important. The horse's nostrils flared as he tested the air, and then he did something Jake had never seen him do before. Ghost pulled away from him, turned toward the barn, and walked right up to the partially open door. He lowered his head and nickered softly, a sound that seemed to carry more meaning than Jake could interpret. Jake had tried everything. He'd tugged on the lead rope, applying steady pressure the way he'd always done. Ghost didn't budge. He'd walked around to face the horse directly, speaking in the calm, firm voice that usually brought immediate obedience. Ghost ignored him completely, his attention fixed on whatever lay beyond that barn door. Jake had even tried bribery, pulling a carrot from his jacket pocket and holding it out enticingly. Ghost's ears flicked back for a moment, acknowledging the offer, but he didn't move toward it. Instead, he nickered again, that same soft, urgent sound, and pawed at the ground with one hoof. Now Jake stood in the morning sunlight, his hands on his hips, studying his horse with a mixture of frustration and growing curiosity. The golden light of late autumn slanted across the property, illuminating the dust motes that drifted in the air and highlighting the cracks in the barn's old boards. Through those cracks, through the partially open door, Jake could see shadows and hints of the interior he'd barely visited in years. The barn had become a storage space for things he didn't need, but couldn't quite bring himself to throw away. Old tack that had belonged to his father, broken equipment that might someday be useful for parts, boxes of his grandmother's belongings that he'd never gotten around to sorting through after she passed. Ghost nickered again, more insistently this time, and turned to look at Jake with those intelligent dark eyes that seemed almost human in their expressiveness. In that moment, Jake felt something shift in his chest. A premonition, maybe, or just the recognition that something was different about today. Something was calling to Ghost from inside that barn, and whatever it was mattered enough that the most obedient horse Jake had ever known was willing to defy him for the first time in 7 years. Jake took a step closer to the barn, and Ghost immediately moved forward too, as if encouraging him. The horse's entire demeanor had changed from stubborn refusal to eager invitation. Jake could feel his own heart beating faster, though he couldn't have said exactly why. It was just an old barn, just a building full of junk and memories and things he'd been avoiding dealing with for too long. But Ghost knew something he didn't. Animals had instincts that humans had lost somewhere along the way, senses that picked up on things invisible to human perception. Jake had learned long ago to trust Ghost's judgment, and he wasn't about to stop now. The barn door creaked on its ancient hinges as Jake pulled it wider, the sound echoing in the quiet morning. The interior was dim, lit only by thin beams of sunlight that penetrated through gaps in the walls and roof. Dust swirled in those beams, creating patterns that seemed almost alive. The smell hit him immediately, that distinctive scent of old wood, hay, leather, and time itself. It was a smell that carried memories, that transported him back to childhood afternoons spent exploring while his grandfather worked. Ghost moved forward without hesitation now, pulling Jake gently but insistently toward the darkness, toward whatever mystery lay waiting in the shadows of a barn that Jake had been ready to destroy. And as Jake's eyes began to adjust to the dim light, as he followed his white horse deeper into the building he thought he knew so well, he had no idea that everything he believed about his family, his property, and his own future was about to change forever. The interior of the barn felt colder than it should have given the mild temperature outside. Jake pulled his jacket closer as Ghost led him past the rusted farming equipment his grandfather had used decades ago, past the old workbench still cluttered with tools whose purposes Jake had forgotten, past stacks of hay bales that had long since turned gray with age. The horse moved with purpose, weaving through the cluttered space as if following a path only he could see. Jake found himself holding his breath, listening for whatever sound might have attracted Ghost's attention. But he heard nothing except the creaking of old wood and the soft shuffle of the horse's hooves on the dirt floor. They were halfway through the barn when Ghost stopped again. This time, though, it wasn't the stubborn refusal of before. This was different. The horse's entire body had gone still, his head raised, his ears swiveling forward toward the far corner where shadows pooled deepest. Jake followed his gaze and saw what he'd forgotten was even there. The old tack room. His great-grandfather had built it as a separate space within the barn, a small room with proper walls and a door that locked, where valuable equipment could be stored safely away from moisture and thieves. Jake hadn't opened that door in at least 5 years, maybe longer. Ghost took another step forward, then another, drawing Jake inexorably toward the tack room. As they got closer, Jake noticed something odd. The door wasn't quite closed. It hung open perhaps an inch, enough to create a thin line of deeper darkness in the already dim barn. He was certain he'd left it shut the last time he'd been in here. In fact, he distinctly remembered checking all the doors before winter set in last year, making sure everything was secured against the elements. Someone had been in here. The thought sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. His property was miles from the nearest neighbor, and he kept a close watch on the boundaries. Who would have cause to break into an old barn that everyone in the county knew was scheduled for demolition? Ghost nickered again, softer this time, almost gentle. It was the sound he made when approaching something that needed comfort, the same tone he used with frightened foals or injured animals. Jake's hand instinctively moved to the knife he kept clipped to his belt, though he wasn't sure what threat he expected to find in a dusty tack room. Still, 7 years of law enforcement before he'd inherited the ranch had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now his instincts were telling him something was very wrong. He reached out slowly and pushed the tack room door open wider. The hinges protested with a screech that seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space. The room beyond was darker than the barn itself, with only the faintest light filtering through cracks in the exterior wall. Jake pulled his phone from his pocket and activated the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the small space. Old saddles hung on the walls, their leather cracked and dusty. Bridles dangled from hooks, their metal bits tarnished with age. Boxes were stacked in one corner, their cardboard sides soft with moisture damage. Everything looked exactly as he remembered it, untouched and forgotten. But Ghost was focused on something specific. The horse pushed past Jake, gentle but insistent, and moved toward the far wall where a heavy wool blanket hung from a nail. It was one of his grandmother's old blankets, Jake remembered now. She'd kept it out here for wrapping newborn foals during cold nights. The blanket looked different somehow, though Jake couldn't immediately identify what had changed. Then he realized the bottom edge was moving slightly, as if disturbed by a breeze, though there was no wind in the enclosed space. Jake approached the blanket cautiously, Ghost so close behind him that he could feel the horse's warm breath on his neck. He reached out and grasped the edge of the wool, rough and dusty under his fingers, and pulled it aside. What he found behind it made him take an involuntary step backward, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. There was a hole in the wall, not a crack or a gap from deteriorating boards, but an actual hole, deliberately made, the edges of the boards cut cleanly and recently. The opening was perhaps 3 feet square, large enough for a person to crawl through, and beyond it, Jake could see not the exterior of the barn as he'd expected, but darkness. A space between the walls that shouldn't exist. His great-grandfather had built a false wall. The realization came slowly, piecing together what he was seeing with what he knew about the barn's construction. The tack room had always seemed oddly small given the barn's overall dimensions, but Jake had never thought to question it. Why would he? It was just a storage room in a building he rarely visited. But now, staring into that hidden space, he understood that there was an entire section of the barn he'd never known existed. A secret room built into the structure over a century ago, concealed so carefully that 3 generations of Morrisons had lived on this property without ever discovering it. Ghost pushed forward again, lowering his head toward the opening and nickering with that same gentle, urgent tone. Jake shone his flashlight through the hole, his hand shaking slightly as the beam pierced the darkness beyond. The space was larger than he'd expected, perhaps 10 feet by 12 feet, with a ceiling high enough for a man to stand comfortably. And it wasn't empty. Jake could make out shapes in the darkness, objects carefully arranged and covered with cloth. But more than that, more immediate and inexplicable than anything else, he could hear something, a sound so faint he almost missed it beneath the pounding of his own pulse, a rhythmic sound. Breathing. Something alive was in there, had been in there possibly for days or weeks, and Ghost had known it. Somehow, with senses Jake couldn't begin to understand, his horse had known there was life hidden in the walls of this forgotten barn. Jake's mouth had gone dry. His training told him to back away, to call the sheriff, to approach this situation with backup and caution. But Ghost was already moving forward, already trying to push through the opening, and Jake found himself following, unable to resist the pull of mystery and the trust he had in his horse's judgment. Whatever was in that hidden room, whatever secret his great-grandfather had built these walls to conceal, Jake was about to discover it. Jake squeezed through the opening in the wall, his shoulders scraping against the rough wood as he maneuvered into the hidden space. The air inside was stale but not unpleasant, carrying a faint scent of old paper and something else he couldn't quite identify. His flashlight beam swept across the room, revealing details that made his breath catch in his throat. This wasn't just a hidden storage space, it was a refuge. Someone had lived here, or at least spent considerable time here, and recently. Against the far wall stood a narrow cot, its metal frame sturdy despite its age. A sleeping bag lay neatly folded at one end, and beside it sat a small camping lantern, the kind that ran on batteries. Jake's light caught the edge of a plastic water jug, still half full, and next to it a small cardboard box that appeared to contain food supplies. Crackers he could see through the open top, canned goods, a jar of peanut butter, the basics for survival. But it was what he saw next that made his heart clench with an emotion he couldn't immediately name. In the corner, partially hidden behind one of the cloth-covered shapes, was a child's backpack. It was bright blue with cartoon characters on it, wildly out of place in this dusty secret room. Next to it lay a small stuffed animal, a worn teddy bear that had clearly been loved for years, and there, curled up on a pile of blankets that looked like they'd come from Jake's own linen closet, was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 10 or 11 years old, with dark hair that fell in tangled waves around her face. She was asleep, her breathing the sound Jake had heard from outside, and even in the dim light he could see the exhaustion etched into her young features. Ghost had somehow managed to get his head through the opening, and he nickered again, that soft, gentle sound as if greeting someone he'd been searching for. The girl's eyes flew open at the noise. They were wide and dark and filled with immediate terror. She scrambled backward against the wall, her small body pressing into the corner as if she could disappear into the very boards. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She just stared at Jake with the kind of fear that spoke of terrible experiences, of trust broken so completely that the presence of any adult meant danger. Jake immediately held up his hands, palms forward, and took a step back. Every instinct he had from his years in law enforcement kicked in. This was a terrified child in what appeared to be a hiding place. She'd broken into his property, yes, but the why of it was written all over her face, and in the meager supplies she'd gathered, she was running from something, or someone. His mind raced through possibilities: abuse, neglect. Maybe she'd run away from foster care. Whatever the reason, she'd found her way to his abandoned barn and had been hiding here, alone, for who knew how long. "It's okay," he said quietly, keeping his voice as gentle as Ghost's nickering had been. "I'm not going to hurt you. I promise. I'm Jake. This is my property, but you're not in trouble." The girl didn't respond. Her eyes darted from him to Ghost and back again, calculating distances, probably planning her escape route if she could get past them. Jake could see her trembling, could see the way her hands gripped the blanket as if it could somehow protect her. He'd seen this kind of fear before, in his work, and it always gutted him. Children shouldn't have to know this kind of terror. Ghost nickered again, and the girl's attention fixed on the horse. Something changed in her expression. Not trust, not yet, but a slight lessening of the panic. Animals were often easier for traumatized kids to accept than humans. They didn't lie or hurt in the ways that people did. Jake saw his opportunity and took it. "My horse found you," he said softly. "His name is Ghost. He wouldn't leave the barn this morning. Just planted himself outside and refused to move until I came in to see what was bothering him. I think he knew you needed help." The girl's eyes stayed on Ghost. Her breathing was starting to slow, just slightly. Jake remained perfectly still, letting her look, letting her decide if they were a threat. He'd learned long ago that you couldn't force trust. You had to earn it second by painful second, especially with kids who'd been given every reason not to trust. "How long have you been here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl's lips pressed together. She wasn't going to answer that. "Fair enough. Are you hurt? Do you need a doctor?" A small shake of her head, so slight he almost missed it. But it was communication. That was progress. Jake's mind was already working through the practical concerns. This girl needed help, real help, but if he called the authorities right now, she'd bolt. He could see it in her posture, in the way her eyes kept flicking to the opening in the wall. She'd run, and he might never find her again. And if she was running from abuse, running from danger, putting her back into the system without knowing her story could put her right back into harm's way. He'd seen it happen before, seen kids return to situations that should never have been allowed, all because the system was overwhelmed and overworked and sometimes made terrible mistakes. Ghost pushed further into the room, his large body somehow fitting through the opening that seemed too small for him. The horse moved slowly, carefully, approaching the girl the way he might approach a frightened colt. The girl watched him come, her fear gradually giving way to wonder. When Ghost was close enough, he lowered his head and breathed gently against her hair. And then something remarkable happened. The girl reached up, slowly, hesitantly, and touched Ghost's nose. Her fingers were small and dirty and shaking, but they made contact. The horse stood perfectly still, letting her explore, letting her take this tiny step toward connection. Tears began to stream down the girl's face, silent and heartbreaking. She pressed her forehead against Ghost's nose and her small shoulders shook with sobs she was clearly trying to suppress. Jake felt his own throat tighten. Whatever this child had been through, whatever had driven her to hide in a stranger's barn, living on crackers and water, sleeping alone in the dark, it had been bad enough that simple kindness from an animal broke through her defenses completely. He wanted to gather her up, to promise her that everything would be okay, but he knew better. He had to move slowly, had to let her come to trust on her own terms. "You can stay," he said finally, the decision forming even as he spoke the words. "You can stay here as long as you need to. I won't call anyone. I won't tell anyone you're here. Not until you're ready. But I'd like to help you if you'll let me. Maybe bring you some better food, some clean clothes, whatever you need." The girl pulled back from Ghost and looked at Jake with those dark, searching eyes. She was trying to decide if he was telling the truth, if this was a trap, if she could afford to believe him. The silence stretched between them, filled only with Ghost's gentle breathing and the distant sounds of the morning outside. Then, almost imperceptibly, the girl nodded. Jake left the barn an hour later with a mental list of items he needed to gather and more questions than answers. The girl hadn't spoken a single word, but she'd accepted the granola bar he'd had in his jacket pocket and had drunk half a bottle of water he'd retrieved from his truck. Small victories. She'd also let him examine her arms and legs for injuries, though she'd flinched away when he'd moved too quickly. No obvious signs of physical abuse, but the psychological wounds were clear enough. Those would take longer to heal than any broken bone. He'd learned her name, though. Or at least he'd learned what she was willing to tell him. When he'd asked, she'd pointed to the backpack in the corner, and he'd found a name tag sewn into the inner pocket. Emma. No last name, just Emma written in careful block letters that looked like they'd been done by a child's hand. The backpack itself contained a few changes of clothes, all too small for her current size, a dog-eared paperback book about horses, and a small wooden box that she'd clutched protectively when he'd gotten too close to it. Whatever was in that box mattered to her, and Jake respected her privacy enough not to push. The house felt different when he walked through the front door. Emptier somehow, though it had always been just him rattling around in the 4-bedroom ranch house his grandparents had built. He'd inherited the property 3 years ago when his grandmother passed, and he'd moved back from his apartment in town, thinking the space and solitude would help him process everything he'd seen during his years in law enforcement. The counselor had called it burnout. Jake called it a necessary retreat. Either way, he'd been alone here ever since, and he'd convinced himself he preferred it that way. Now he moved through the rooms with purpose, gathering supplies, clean towels and washcloths from the linen closet, a warm jacket that had belonged to his younger sister before she'd moved to Seattle. It would be too big for Emma, but it would keep her warm. He raided the pantry for food that didn't require cooking, since there was no way to heat anything in the hidden room without risking a fire. Peanut butter and jelly, bread, apples, cheese and crackers. Juice boxes he'd bought months ago for his nephew's visit and never used. He packed everything into a canvas bag, then added a battery-powered lamp, extra batteries, and a small first aid kit. His phone buzzed in his pocket as he was heading back outside. Sarah Chen, his nearest neighbor and closest friend, checking in as she did most mornings. They'd known each other since high school, and she ran a horse rescue operation on the property adjacent to his. She was one of the few people who understood his need for solitude, but also knew when to push him to maintain human contact. Her text was typically direct. "Coffee tomorrow morning? You're becoming a hermit." He stared at the message for a long moment, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. He hated lying to Sarah, but he couldn't tell her about Emma. Not yet. Not until he understood more about the situation. He typed back a quick response. "Sure. 8, okay?" Her reply came immediately. "Perfect. And Jake, whatever you're brooding about, remember you're allowed to ask for help. You know that, right?" The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, literally helping someone, and he couldn't tell the one person who'd probably have useful advice about how to handle it. But Sarah would insist on calling Child Protective Services, and Jake's instincts were screaming that involving the authorities right now would be the worst possible thing he could do. Emma had run from something. Until he knew what, he wasn't going to risk sending her back to it. He pocketed the phone and headed back to the barn, Ghost following him like a shadow. The horse had refused to leave the barn earlier, and even now kept looking back toward it as if to make sure Emma was still there. The sun was higher in the sky when Jake ducked back through the opening in the wall. Emma was exactly where he'd left her, curled up on the blankets with the teddy bear clutched to her chest. She looked so small in that moment, so vulnerable, that Jake felt a fierce surge of protectiveness. Someone had failed this child. Someone who should have kept her safe had done the opposite, and now she was hiding in a stranger's barn, terrified and alone. He set the canvas bag down gently and began unpacking the supplies, explaining each item as he did. "Clean clothes. You don't have to wear them if you don't want to, but they're here. Food. I brought a bunch of different things. Help yourself to whatever sounds good. A better lamp. This one's brighter and the batteries will last longer." Emma watched him with those careful, calculating eyes. She reached out slowly and touched the jacket he'd laid on the cot, her fingers tracing the soft fleece lining. Then she looked up at him with an expression that might have been gratitude, though it was hard to tell through the layers of fear and suspicion. Jake settled himself on the floor, keeping distance between them, and Ghost lay down beside him, his large body a comforting presence in the small space. "We need to figure out a few things," Jake said quietly. "I won't push you to talk about where you came from or why you're here. That's your business. But I need to know if someone's actively looking for you, if there's danger coming to my property. Are the police searching for you?" A shake of her head. "Quick and definite." "Okay. What about family? Parents?" A longer pause this time. Then she held up one finger. "One parent." Jake's stomach tightened. "Is that person looking for you?" Emma's face went pale. She nodded, and the fear that flashed through her eyes told Jake everything he needed to know. Whoever that parent was, Emma was terrified of them. "And you can't go back there," he said. It wasn't a question. Another nod, this one more emphatic. Her small hand gripped the teddy bear tighter, and Jake noticed for the first time that one of the bear's arms had been carefully stitched back on, the thread not quite matching the original fabric. "All right." Jake took a deep breath, knowing he was about to cross a line that might have serious consequences. "Then we'll figure this out together. But I need you to trust me enough to help me understand what we're dealing with. You don't have to tell me everything. Not today. But eventually, I'm going to need to know your story." Emma considered this for what felt like a long time. Then she reached for the canvas bag and pulled out the notebook and pen Jake had tucked in at the last minute, thinking she might prefer writing to speaking. She opened to the first page and wrote in careful letters, her handwriting much neater than most kids her age. When she turned the notebook around so Jake could read it, His heart sank at the simple sentence that explained so much. My father hurts people, and the police don't believe kids like me. Over the next 3 days, Jake fell into a routine that felt both natural and surreal. He'd wake before dawn, take care of his regular ranch duties with Ghost by his side, then make his way to the hidden room with food, supplies, and updates about the world outside. Emma remained mostly silent, communicating through nods, shakes of her head, and occasional written notes in the notebook that was quickly filling with her careful handwriting. But slowly, incrementally, she was beginning to trust him. He could see it in the way she no longer flinched when he entered the room, in how she'd started to ask questions through her notes, in the fact that she actually smiled when Ghost nuzzled her hand. Jake learned things about her in fragments. She was 11 years old. She'd been on the run for almost 2 weeks, traveling mostly at night, stealing food when she had to, sleeping wherever she could find shelter. She'd found his barn by accident, drawn by the sight of horses in the pasture and the hope that a place with animals might be safer than the alternatives she'd encountered. The wooden box she guarded so carefully contained photographs, she finally revealed. Pictures of her mother, who had died 3 years ago. After that, everything had changed. Her father, who Emma wrote about only in the vaguest terms, had become someone different, someone dangerous. The specifics of what her father had done remained unclear. Emma's notes danced around the subject, hinting at violence witnessed but never directly experienced, at threats made but not yet carried out, at a growing sense that something terrible was coming, and she needed to run before it arrived. Jake's law enforcement training told him this was a pattern he'd seen before. Domestic violence situations that escalated slowly, children caught in the crossfire, the system failing to act until it was too late. He wanted to push for more details, to understand exactly what they were dealing with, but he forced himself to be patient. Emma would tell him when she was ready. What worried him most was the question she'd written on the 4th morning. How long until you make me leave? The words had been surrounded by eraser marks, as if she'd written and rewritten the question multiple times before settling on this version. Jake had stared at those words for a long time before answering. I'm not going to make you leave, Emma. We're going to figure out a way to keep you safe. But that might mean we have to tell some people who can help. People who will believe you this time. Her response had been immediate and emphatic. No police. The letters had been pressed so hard into the paper that they'd nearly torn through. Jake had backed off then, but the interaction had crystallized something in his mind. Emma needed more than just a hiding place and regular meals. She needed protection that he alone couldn't provide, and she needed it in a way that wouldn't trigger whatever trauma the system had already inflicted on her. He spent that evening after his chores researching on his laptop, digging through databases he still had access to from his law enforcement days, looking for any missing child reports that matched Emma's description. What he found made his blood run cold. There was no missing child report, no Amber Alert, no indication that anyone was officially looking for a lost 11-year-old girl. Either Emma's father hadn't reported her missing, which suggested he had reasons not to want police involvement, or he'd reported her as a runaway and the system had classified her as low priority. Both possibilities were deeply troubling. Jake expanded his search, looking for anything that might give him a clue about who Emma's father was and what he was capable of. Without a last name, it was nearly impossible, but he kept trying, driven by the growing certainty that time was not on their side. Sarah came by on the 5th day, arriving unannounced in her battered pickup truck with a thermos of coffee and a determined expression that Jake recognized immediately. She was worried about him, and she wasn't leaving until she'd satisfied herself that he was okay. They sat on his porch, drinking coffee and talking about nothing important, while Jake fought the urge to confess everything. Sarah would help if he asked. She'd probably even understand why he'd kept Emma's presence secret, but telling her would make her complicit in what was technically harboring a runaway. and Jake wasn't willing to drag his best friend into legal jeopardy. "You're being weird," Sarah said finally, studying him over the rim of her coffee cup. "Weirder than usual, I mean. What's going on?" "Nothing. Just busy with ranch work." She didn't believe him. He could see it in her eyes, in the way her mouth pressed into a thin line. "Jake Morrison, I've known you for 20 years. I know when you're lying, and you're lying right now." He wanted to tell her. The words were right there, pressing against his teeth, demanding to be spoken. But he thought about Emma's fear, about the way she'd written "no police" in letters that nearly tore the paper, and he kept his mouth shut. "I promise I'm fine. Just got a lot on my mind. That's all." Sarah sighed and stood up, clearly disappointed but unwilling to push further. "Fine. Keep your secrets. But when you're ready to talk, I'm here. You know that, right?" "I know." "Thanks, Sarah." She drove away in a cloud of dust, and Jake felt the weight of isolation settle more heavily on his shoulders. He was making decisions that could have serious consequences, and he was making them alone. If he was wrong about Emma, if she was lying or manipulating him, or if her father was actually innocent and looking desperately for his missing daughter, Jake could end up facing criminal charges. But when he made his way back to the barn that evening, when Emma looked up at him with those dark eyes that held too much knowledge for someone her age, he knew he couldn't have made any other choice. Ghost had taken to spending most of his time near the barn, as if standing guard over the secret they all shared. The other horses in Jake's small herd had noticed the white gelding's unusual behavior, but they seemed content to let him keep his vigil. Animals understood things humans didn't, Jake had always believed. They knew when something needed protecting. That night, Jake brought Emma a battery-powered heater he'd found in storage, the November temperatures dropping enough that the hidden room was becoming uncomfortably cold. He also brought more blankets, a pillow from his own bed, and a paperback novel he'd enjoyed at her age. Emma had made the space more her own over the past few days. She'd arranged her few possessions neatly on an old crate that served as a makeshift table. The teddy bear sat propped against the wall where she could see it. The wooden box with her mother's photographs rested within easy reach. She'd even swept the floor, using an old broom she'd found in the outer barn, creating a small circle of order in the dusty space. It reminded Jake of how children tried to create normalcy even in the most abnormal circumstances, how they adapted and survived when adults failed them. As Jake set up the heater and arranged the blankets, Emma wrote something in her notebook and held it up for him to read. "Why are you helping me?" It was the question he'd been asking himself every day since he'd found her. The answer should have been simple. Because it was the right thing to do. Because she was a child in need. But the truth was more complicated than that. He was helping her because Ghost had refused to leave the barn. Because sometimes fate or coincidence or divine intervention put people in your path for reasons you couldn't fully understand. Because in helping her, he was also helping himself, filling the emptiness that had haunted him since he'd left law enforcement. "Because you needed help, and I was here," Jake said finally, settling onto the floor where he'd taken to sitting during their evening conversations. "And because Ghost knew you needed help before I did." Emma's lips curved into a small smile at the mention of the horse. She'd grown attached to Ghost over the past few days, and the feeling was clearly mutual. The white gelding spent hours with his head poking through the opening in the wall, content to simply be near the girl who'd needed finding. Jake had never seen Ghost behave this way with anyone, not even with him, and it reinforced his belief that he was doing the right thing even if the law might disagree. That night, Emma wrote more than she ever had before. The words came slowly at first, then faster, as if a dam had broken inside her. Jake sat quietly and read each page as she finished it, his heart growing heavier with every sentence. Emma's mother had died in a car accident 3 years ago, a drunk driver running a red light on a Tuesday afternoon. Her father, Marcus Webb, had been a different man before that. Funny, kind, involved in Emma's life in all the ways a good father should be. But grief had changed him, twisted something inside until the man Emma had known disappeared entirely. He'd started drinking within months of the funeral. Not socially, not occasionally, but heavily and consistently. With the drinking came anger, explosive rages over small things that wouldn't have bothered him before. Emma learned to make herself invisible, to stay quiet and out of the way, to read the signs that meant she needed to disappear into her room and lock the door. But it wasn't her he hurt, not directly. It was other people. Bar fights that escalated into brutal beatings. Arguments with neighbors that turned violent. A co-worker who'd criticized his work and ended up hospitalized with a broken jaw. Each time Marcus had talked his way out of serious consequences. He was a respected contractor, well known in their small Idaho town. He'd built half the houses in the county. People liked him, or at least they had before. And he was smart enough to pick victims who wouldn't or couldn't press charges. Drifters passing through town. People with their own legal troubles who didn't want police scrutiny. The co-worker had been paid off, convinced that pursuing charges would cost him his own job. Emma had watched it happen again and again, her father's violence growing worse while the community turned a blind eye. She'd tried to tell people. A teacher at school who'd noticed bruises on Emma's arms, bruises that came from Marcus grabbing her too hard when he was drunk, shaking her when she'd tried to intervene in one of his rages. The teacher had reported it and Child Protective Services had come to investigate. But Marcus had been sober and charming during the home visit, the house immaculate, his concern for Emma's well-being apparently genuine. He'd explained the bruises away as normal childhood clumsiness, and Emma, terrified of what he'd do if she contradicted him, had confirmed his story. The case was closed within a week. She'd tried again with the school counselor, but by then she'd been labeled as a troubled child acting out over her mother's death. The counselor had suggested therapy and prescribed techniques for dealing with grief, completely missing the reality of what was happening at home. Emma had learned that adults didn't want to believe that someone like Marcus Webb, pillar of the community, could be capable of the things she was describing. It was easier to think a child was confused or lying, or struggling to process her mother's death in unhealthy ways. The final straw had come 3 weeks ago. Marcus had gotten into an argument with a man at a gas station, something stupid about who was next in line. Emma had been in the truck, waiting for her father to pay for fuel, when she'd seen him follow the man behind the building. She'd heard the sounds of the beating, the sickening thuds of fists on flesh, the man's cries for help that no one answered. When Marcus returned to the truck, his knuckles were bloody, and there was something in his eyes that Emma had never seen before, not just anger but satisfaction, pleasure in what he'd done. That night, after Marcus had passed out drunk on the couch, Emma had packed her backpack with everything she could carry and run. She'd been running ever since, stealing rides when she could, walking when she couldn't, always moving, always looking over her shoulder. She'd seen the news reports after she'd been gone a week. The man from the gas station had died from his injuries 3 days after the beating. Marcus Webb was wanted for murder, and Emma was the only witness who could place him at the scene. Jake felt sick as he read the final pages of Emma's story. This wasn't just a case of domestic violence or a child running from an abusive home. This was a murder investigation, and Emma was a material witness. But she was also a child who'd tried repeatedly to get help from the system and been ignored every single time. A child who had every reason to believe that speaking up would either get her killed or land her back in her father's custody, while he charmed his way out of consequences one more time. "Do the police know you saw what happened?" Jake asked carefully. Emma shook her head, then wrote quickly, "My father knows. He was awake when I left. He saw me pack, saw me run. He knows I'm the only one who can prove he did it. The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. Marcus Webb wasn't just a father looking for his missing daughter. He was a murderer hunting the only witness who could put him away for life. And Emma had been hiding in Jake's barn for nearly 2 weeks, which meant Marcus had probably been searching for her all that time. The question wasn't if he'd eventually find his way here, but when. Jake's law enforcement instincts screamed at him to call this in immediately, to get Emma into protective custody where trained professionals could keep her safe. But he looked at the girl sitting across from him, at the fear and exhaustion etched into her young face, at the way her hand clutched that teddy bear like it was the only solid thing in a world that had proven itself utterly unreliable, and he knew that the system had already failed her too many times. One more betrayal might break something in her that could never be repaired. "We need to be smart about this," he said finally. "Your father is looking for you. That means we need to assume he might find you eventually. We need a plan for what happens if he shows up here." Emma's eyes went wide with fear, but Jake pressed on. "I won't let him take you. I promise you that. But I need you to trust me enough to let me bring in help, not the police, not yet, but people I trust, people who will believe you and protect you." Emma stared at him for a long moment, then wrote one word. "Who?" Jake spent the next morning making calls he probably should have made days ago. The first was to Tom Martinez, his former partner from his law enforcement days. Tom had left the force 6 months before Jake, burned out by the same cases and the same systemic failures that had driven Jake away. Now Tom ran a private security consulting business, and more importantly, he owed Jake his life from an incident neither of them talked about but both remembered. When Jake explained the situation in careful terms, leaving out specifics over the phone, Tom's response was immediate. "I'll be there by tonight. Don't do anything stupid until I arrive." The second call was harder. Sarah deserved to know the truth, but bringing her in meant potentially endangering her or making her an accessory to what was technically a crime. Jake sat in his truck for 20 minutes, phone in hand, before finally dialing her number. When she answered, he didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need your help with something that might get complicated. Can you come to the ranch this afternoon?" There was a pause. Then Sarah's voice came back steady and certain. "I'll be there in an hour. And Jake, whatever it is, you should have told me sooner." Emma was less enthusiastic about expanding their circle. When Jake explained that he'd asked 2 people to come help, she'd retreated into the corner of the hidden room, her arms wrapped around herself. The teddy bear clutched against her chest. Her eyes held the same wild panic he'd seen that first day, and it took Ghost's gentle presence and Jake's patient reassurance to calm her enough to listen. "These are good people," he said quietly. "Tom saved my life once, and I've saved his. Sarah runs a horse rescue, and she's helped more troubled kids than I can count. They'll understand what you've been through. They'll believe you, and most importantly, they'll help us keep you safe." "But what if they tell?" Emma wrote, her hand shaking so badly the letters were barely legible. "What if they think they're helping by calling the police and then my father finds out where I am?" Jake had anticipated this fear. "That's why I'm telling them to come here first, so you can meet them, so you can hear what they have to say. And if you don't feel safe with them knowing about you, we'll figure out another plan. But Emma, I can't protect you alone. Not against someone like your father. I need backup, and I need people I trust absolutely." Sarah arrived first, parking her truck next to Jake's and walking toward the house with the purposeful stride of someone who'd been worried and was now ready for answers. Jake met her on the porch, and before he could say anything, she held up her hand. "Just tell me. Whatever it is, just tell me." So he did. He told her about Ghost's refusal to leave the barn, about the hidden room his great-grandfather had built, about Emma and her father and the murder in Idaho. He told her about the failed CPS investigation and the witness that no one had believed. Sarah listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with each detail, and when Jake finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You've been hiding a material witness to a murder for 2 weeks," she said finally. "You could go to prison for this." "I know. But you've seen what I've seen, Sarah. You know how the system works. How many kids have come through your rescue operation after being failed by foster care, by social services, by every adult who was supposed to protect them?" Emma tried to get help, multiple times, and every time the system sent her back to the man who's now wanted for murder. Sarah's jaw tightened. "How old is she?" 11. A muscle jumped in Sarah's cheek. She had that look Jake recognized, the one that appeared when she was dealing with a horse that had been abused or neglected. That fierce protectiveness that made her one of the best advocates for the powerless he'd ever known. "I want to meet her." They walked to the barn together, Ghost trailing behind them like a guardian angel. Jake had warned Emma that Sarah was coming, and when they ducked through the opening in the wall, Emma was standing in the center of the room rather than hiding in the corner. It was a small act of courage, but Jake recognized it for what it was. She was trying to trust, trying to believe that maybe this time an adult would actually help rather than hurt. Sarah took one look at Emma, and her expression softened in a way that made Jake's chest tighten. "Hi, Emma," she said gently, lowering herself to sit on the floor in a non-threatening posture. "My name's Sarah. Jake tells me you've been very brave." Emma didn't respond, just watched Sarah with those careful, calculating eyes. Sarah didn't push. She simply sat there, letting Emma study her, letting the silence stretch until it felt almost comfortable. Finally, Emma picked up her notebook and wrote something, then held it up. "Jake says you help kids." Sarah nodded. "I help horses mostly. But I've learned that hurt horses and hurt kids have a lot in common. They need time, patience, and someone who won't give up on them even when they're difficult." "I don't give up easily, Emma. And neither does Jake." Something in Emma's posture relaxed slightly. She wrote again. "My father will come here eventually. He won't stop looking." "I know," Sarah replied. "That's why we're going to make a plan. A good plan. The kind that keeps you safe no matter what happens." Emma studied her for another long moment, then nodded slowly. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was acceptance. Sarah could stay. She could be part of this. And that meant they were one step closer to having a real chance of protecting this child who'd been failed so completely by everyone who should have helped her. Tom Martinez arrived as the sun was setting, driving a nondescript sedan that probably had more security features than it appeared. He was a big man, nearly Jake's height but broader, with the kind of solid presence that made people feel safer just by being near him. He greeted Jake with a brief hug, then listened as Jake brought him up to speed on everything that had happened since their phone call. Tom's expression remained neutral throughout, but Jake could see the wheels turning behind his eyes, the tactical mind already working on solutions. When they introduced Tom to Emma, she was visibly more nervous than she'd been with Sarah. Tom was a large man, and Emma had learned to fear large men. But Tom handled it perfectly. He sat down cross-legged on the floor, making himself as small and non-threatening as possible. And when he spoke, his voice was gentle in a way that contrasted sharply with his intimidating appearance. "Emma, I used to work with kids who'd been through trauma, kids who'd seen things they shouldn't have seen. I know you've been hurt by adults who should have protected you. I can't undo that, but I can promise you that I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere until we figure out how to keep you safe. Your father won't get to you, not while I'm around." Emma wrote in her notebook and showed it to Tom. "You promise?" Tom met her eyes steadily. "I promise. On my life and my honor, I promise." And that seemed to be enough. Emma nodded, and Tom smiled, a warm, genuine expression that transformed his entire face. The four of them sat in that hidden room as darkness fell outside, Ghost's head poking through the opening as always, and began to plan. They mapped out the property, identifying weak points and strong defensive positions. They discussed what to do if Marcus Webb showed up, how to keep Emma hidden while dealing with him, when it would be necessary to call law enforcement despite Emma's fears. Tom suggested installing motion sensors along the property perimeter, cameras that would give them advance warning of anyone approaching. Sarah offered to have Emma stay at her place if things got too dangerous at Jake's ranch. Tom worked through the night installing security equipment, motion sensors along the main road, and the 2 back access points that someone on foot might use to approach the property. Wireless cameras positioned to cover the barn, the house, and the open areas between. He set up a monitoring system in Jake's living room, 4 screens showing different angles, with alerts that would ping both his phone and Jake's if anything triggered the sensors. It was a professional setup, the kind that would cost thousands if purchased commercially, but Tom had connections and equipment left over from previous jobs. By sunrise, Jake's ranch had better security than most government buildings. Sarah spent those same hours with Emma, talking quietly about nothing important while helping her organize the hidden room into something more livable. She brought a camping mattress to replace the uncomfortable cot, thick blankets that Emma could actually stay warm under, and battery-powered fairy lights that made the space feel less like a hiding place and more like a sanctuary. But more than the physical improvements, Sarah offered something Emma had been missing for years. Someone who listened without judgment, who believed her story without question, who understood that sometimes surviving meant making choices that other people might not understand. Jake watched from the doorway as Sarah brushed Emma's tangled hair with patient, gentle strokes, working through knots that had probably been there for weeks. Emma's eyes were closed, and there was something peaceful in her expression that Jake hadn't seen before. Sarah was humming softly, some tune Jake didn't recognize, and Emma was actually leaning into the touch rather than flinching away from it. It was such a simple thing, this basic act of care, but it represented a monumental shift. Emma was beginning to believe that maybe, possibly, she could be safe here. The normalcy lasted 3 days. 3 days of careful routine where Emma spent her mornings with Sarah, learning to help with the horse rescue work that Sarah did. 3 days of Ghost standing guard outside the hidden room, refusing to leave his post except for brief periods when Tom took over watching. 3 days of Jake teaching Emma how to play chess in the evenings using an old set his grandfather had carved from wood. 3 days where Emma's smiles came more easily, and her notebook remained mostly unused because she'd started speaking in short, quiet sentences that grew gradually longer. On the 4th day, everything changed. Jake was in town buying supplies when his phone buzzed with an alert from the security system. Movement detected at the south perimeter. He pulled up the camera feed on his phone and felt his blood turn to ice. A man was walking up the long driveway toward the house, and even through the grainy security footage, Jake could see the resemblance to Emma. Same dark hair, same build, same way of moving. Marcus Webb had found them. Jake's fingers flew across his phone, sending alerts to both Tom and Sarah. Then he was running for his truck, his purchases forgotten on the store counter, the elderly clerk calling after him in confusion. He drove faster than he should have, the truck fishtailing on the gravel road, his mind racing through scenarios. Tom would get Emma out of the barn, would move her to the secondary hiding place they'd prepared in Sarah's basement. Sarah would secure the horses and then disappear with Emma before Marcus could get close. They'd practiced this. They'd planned for this exact situation. But Jake's hands were shaking on the steering wheel because plans looked good on paper and fell apart in reality. And if anything happened to Emma because he'd been too slow or too stupid or too confident in their preparations, he'd never forgive himself. He was still 2 miles from the ranch when his phone rang. Tom's voice was steady but urgent. "He's at the house," knocked on the front door. "I told him through the security camera that he's trespassing and needs to leave. He says he's looking for his daughter and he has reason to believe she's here." Jake's jaw clenched. "Emma?" safe with Sarah at her place. They left 10 minutes ago using the back trail. He didn't see them. Good. I'm almost there. Don't engage with him unless you have to. I'm on property, Jake. If he tries to force his way in, I'm well within my rights to defend it. Just hold him off until I get there. Jake ended the call and pressed harder on the accelerator. Through his phone, still connected to the security feed, he could see Marcus pacing in front of the house. The man looked nothing like the monster Emma had described. He was average height, average build, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt that could belong to any rancher in Montana, but Jake had learned long ago that evil rarely announced itself with obvious signs. The worst people he'd encountered in law enforcement had often been the most normal-looking, the most charming, the ones everyone else defended because they seemed so ordinary. Marcus was talking to the camera now, his voice carrying through the security system's audio feed. I know she's here. I'm her father. I have a right to see my daughter. Please. I just want to make sure she's okay. The performance was good, Jake had to admit. The concern in Marcus's voice sounded genuine. If Jake didn't know the truth, if he hadn't read Emma's careful documentation of her father's violence, he might have believed it. This was how Marcus had gotten away with everything for so long. This ability to seem reasonable, concerned, normal. Jake pulled into the driveway, his truck kicking up dust as he came to a stop. Marcus turned to face him, and Jake got his first good look at the man who'd been hunting Emma for weeks. There were dark circles under Marcus's eyes, suggesting sleepless nights and stress. His clothes were rumpled, his jaw covered with several days of stubble. He looked like a worried father searching desperately for his missing child. But Jake looked closer and saw what Emma must have seen. The calculation in Marcus's eyes, the tension in his shoulders that spoke of violence barely restrained, the way his hands flexed and clenched as if imagining closing around Emma's throat. Jake got out of the truck slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. Behind Marcus, he could see Tom in the window of the house, positioned with a clear line of sight to the situation. Can I help you? Jake asked, his voice neutral. Marcus's expression brightened with false hope. You're the owner? Yes. Jake Morrison. This is my property, and you're trespassing. I'm sorry. I'm just... Marcus's voice cracked convincingly. I'm looking for my daughter. She's been missing for weeks. I've been searching everywhere. Someone in town said they thought they saw a girl matching her description near this property. Do you mind if I look around? The lie came easily, something Jake had learned to do during his years in law enforcement. Haven't seen any kids around here. It's just me and my horses. But if I do see anyone matching your daughter's description, I'll contact the authorities. Marcus's friendly expression slipped for just a fraction of a second, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. Then the mask was back in place. The authorities haven't been much help, I'm afraid. That's why I'm searching myself. Look, I can see you're a reasonable man. I can see you're a... Just let me look in your barn, check your outbuildings. 5 minutes, that's all I need, then I'll leave you alone. Not without a warrant, Jake replied. I don't let strangers search my property. The tension stretched between them like a wire pulled taut. Marcus's jaw tightened, and for a moment Jake thought he might try something. But then Marcus seemed to collect himself, stepping back with his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. Of course. I understand. I apologize for bothering you. But Mr. Morrison, if you do see a young girl, dark hair, about 11 years old, please, she's my daughter. She's confused, probably scared. She needs to come home where she'll be safe. Jake held Marcus's gaze steadily. If I see anyone like that, I'll make sure they get the help they need. Whatever help that might be. Marcus Webb didn't leave the area. Jake watched through the security cameras as the man drove his truck to the end of the driveway, then parked on the public road just beyond the property line. He sat there for hours, engine occasionally running to keep warm, clearly watching the ranch for any sign of Emma. It was a calculated move, designed to create pressure, to make Jake nervous enough to make a mistake. But it also confirmed what Jake had suspected. Marcus knew Emma was here, or had been here. He wasn't searching randomly. Someone had told him something, or he'd tracked some piece of evidence to this location. Tom joined Jake at the window, both men watching Marcus's truck in silence. "He's not going to give up," Tom said quietly. "Men like that don't. They see people as possessions, and when a possession runs away, they'll burn down the world to get it back." Jake nodded, his mind already working through the implications. "We can't keep Emma hidden forever. Eventually, someone's going to ask questions. The sheriff, child services, someone, and when they do, this all comes apart. So, what are you suggesting? That we have to control when and how that happens?" Tom turned to face Jake directly. "We need to bring in law enforcement, but on our terms. With Emma's testimony recorded, with protection in place, with assurances that she won't be handed back to him." The conversation they'd been avoiding for 2 weeks had finally arrived. Jake had known this moment was coming, had been dreading it because it meant trusting the same system that had failed Emma before. But Tom was right. They couldn't maintain this indefinitely. Emma deserved better than a life spent hiding in barns and basements, always looking over her shoulder, never able to be a normal child. She deserved justice, safety, and a future. And the only way to give her those things was to face Marcus Webb head-on, with the full weight of the law behind them. "I know someone," Tom said. "FBI. She specializes in crimes against children and witness protection. She's good, Jake, really good. And more importantly, she actually gives a damn about the kids instead of just checking boxes on reports." Jake had heard similar promises before, had believed them and been disappointed when reality failed to match the rhetoric. But he trusted Tom's judgment, and right now, trust was all they had. "Make the call. But I want to talk to her first. I want to look her in the eye and know she's going to fight for Emma." Tom made the call that afternoon. By evening, Special Agent Rebecca Santos was driving up the same driveway Marcus Webb had stood on just hours before. She was younger than Jake expected, maybe mid-30s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing as she surveyed the property. Tom had briefed her on the basics, but she wanted to hear everything directly from Jake, every detail about how he'd found Emma and what had happened since. They sat in Jake's kitchen while Tom monitored the security cameras, watching to make sure Marcus hadn't returned. Agent Santos listened without interrupting as Jake explained everything from Ghost's refusal to leave the barn to Marcus's visit that morning. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "You've committed multiple felonies, Mr. Morrison. Harboring a witness, interfering with a murder investigation, potentially obstruction of justice. You understand that? I understand that a child asked for help and every adult who should have protected her failed. I wasn't going to be another failure on that list." Santos's expression softened slightly. "I respect that. And for what it's worth, I probably would have done the same thing. But now we need to fix this properly. I need to interview Emma, get her formal statement on record. Then we need to get her into protective custody before her father makes another move." The word custody made Jake's stomach clench. He'd promised Emma she wouldn't be taken away, wouldn't be put into the system that had failed her before. "This isn't regular foster care," Agent Santos said, reading his expression. "This is federal witness protection. Emma will be placed with a specially trained family, people who understand trauma and know how to keep her safe. She'll go to school under a new identity, she'll have therapy, and most importantly, she'll have marshals assigned specifically to ensure her father can never find her." Jake wanted to believe it, wanted to trust that this time would be different. What about after the trial? After Marcus is convicted? "We'll reassess then. Maybe she can go back to using her real name, maybe not. It depends on whether Marcus has associates who might come after her for revenge. But either way, Emma will have support. Financial, emotional, educational. Everything she needs to build a life. Santos leaned forward, her voice intense. Mr. Morrison, I've been doing this for 12 years. I've seen every variation of abuse and neglect that exists. And I've seen the system fail kids in ways that keep me up at night. But I've also seen it work when good people fight for these children. I'm one of the good people, I promise you that. Jake studied her face, looking for any hint of dishonesty or bureaucratic indifference. He found none. Just determination and genuine compassion. All right, I'll talk to Emma, but the final decision is hers. If she doesn't feel safe with this plan, we find another way. Santos nodded. Fair enough. Where is she now? Safe with a friend. I'll bring her back tonight. But Agent Santos, you need to understand something. Emma's been betrayed by adults her entire life. If you make promises to her, you'd better be prepared to keep them, because if you fail her, the way everyone else has, I will make it my personal mission to ensure you never work another case like this again. Far from being offended, Santos smiled. Good. She deserves someone who'll fight for her that hard. They waited until after dark to bring Emma back, using Tom's car instead of Jake's truck, taking back roads that would be harder for Marcus to watch. Sarah came with Emma, holding the girl's hand as they made their way into the house. Emma looked terrified, her eyes wide and fearful as she took in Agent Santos's presence. She immediately moved to Jake's side, pressing against him like a frightened animal seeking shelter. This was the moment Jake had been dreading. The moment where Emma would feel betrayed by his decision to involve law enforcement. But he knelt down to her level and spoke with complete honesty. Emma, this is Agent Santos. She's with the FBI and she's here to help keep you safe from your father. I know you're scared. I know you don't trust the police. But I've talked to her, and I believe she's different from the people who failed you before. She wants to hear your story, all of it, and she has the power to make sure your father can never hurt you or anyone else again. But this is your choice. If you don't feel safe talking to her, we'll find another way. Emma looked at Agent Santos for a long moment, her hand gripping Jake's shoulder tightly. Santos met the girl's gaze steadily, making no move to approach, letting Emma study her and make her own assessment. Finally, Emma reached for the notebook she always carried and wrote quickly. If I tell you everything, will you promise my father goes to prison? Will you promise I never have to see him again? Santos responded immediately, her voice firm and clear. Yes, on both counts. I promise you, Emma. Your father will pay for what he's done and you will be safe. The notebook came out again. And Jake? Can he still visit me? Will I have to leave Ghost? Agent Santos glanced at Jake, then back at Emma. We'll work something out. I can't promise exactly what that will look like, but I can promise that the people who've helped you won't just disappear from your life. That seemed to be enough. Emma nodded slowly, then moved to sit at the kitchen table. She pulled her notebook closer, took a deep breath, and began to write her formal statement, the one that would finally bring Marcus Webb to justice and give Emma the chance at a real life she'd been denied for so long. Emma's testimony took 3 hours. Agent Santos recorded every word, asking clarifying questions that were gentle but thorough, building a case that would be airtight in court. Emma told everything. The escalating violence after her mother's death, the times she'd tried to get help, the night at the gas station when she'd witnessed the murder. She spoke about the bruises on the victim's face, the way her father's hands had been covered in blood, the sound of the man begging for his life while Marcus kept hitting him. By the end, Emma was exhausted, her voice hoarse from speaking more in one evening than she had in the previous 2 weeks combined. Agent Santos closed her recorder and looked at Emma with something like awe. You're incredibly brave, Emma. What you just did, the courage it took to tell your story knowing it might put you in danger, that's the kind of strength most adults never find. Emma managed a tired smile. Jake says Ghost is brave too, that he protected me even before Jake knew I needed protecting. Santos glanced at Jake with a raised eyebrow, and he explained about the White Horse's refusal to leave the barn, about how Ghost had known something was wrong long before Jake understood. The agent's expression softened. Then Ghost is a very wise horse, and you're lucky to have found each other. The arrest happened the next morning. Marcus Webb had spent the night parked on the road near Jake's property, watching and waiting. When the FBI tactical team surrounded his truck at dawn, he tried to run. It took 4 agents to restrain him, and in the struggle, they found a hunting knife in his jacket and a handgun under the seat. Later, forensic analysis would match that knife to trace evidence from the gas station murder, the final piece of physical proof that sealed his fate. Agent Santos called Jake with the news just after sunrise. He's in custody, federal holding facility, no bail. Emma's safe now, but safe didn't mean healed. That would take time, therapy, and more patience than Jake had known he possessed. Emma stayed at the ranch for 2 more weeks while Agent Santos arranged her placement with a foster family trained in trauma care. During those weeks, something remarkable happened. Emma began to laugh. Small laughs at first, quickly stifled, as if she'd forgotten she was allowed to feel joy. But gradually they came more easily, until the sound of her laughter became part of the ranch's daily rhythm. She spent her days with Ghost, learning to ride him under Sarah's patient instruction. The white gelding was gentle with her in ways he'd never been with anyone else, sensing her fragility and adjusting his movements accordingly. Jake would watch from the barn doorway as Emma brushed Ghost's coat, whispering secrets to the horse that she still couldn't quite bring herself to share with humans. There was healing in that relationship, a trust being rebuilt, one soft wicker and gentle touch at a time. The foster family Agent Santos found lived 3 hours away, close enough for visits, but far enough that Marcus's associates, if he had any, wouldn't think to look there. They were a couple in their 50s named Robert and Linda Chen, no relation to Sarah but connected through the same network of people who dedicated their lives to helping broken children become whole again. When they came to meet Emma, they brought their own rescue dog, a golden retriever named Sunny, who immediately took to Emma with the same intuitive understanding Ghost had shown. The day Emma left was harder than Jake had anticipated. He'd known this moment was coming, had prepared himself for it, but watching her pack her few belongings into a small suitcase still felt like a loss. She'd become part of his life in ways he hadn't expected, filling spaces in his heart he hadn't known were empty. Emma hugged him tightly before she left, her small arms strong around his waist, and whispered the first words she'd ever spoken directly to him, instead of writing them down. Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for believing me when no one else would. Jake had to clear his throat before he could respond. You saved yourself, Emma. You were brave enough to run, smart enough to hide, strong enough to survive. I just gave you a safe place to land. Ghost gets the real credit. Emma pulled back and looked up at him with those dark eyes that had seen too much but were finally beginning to hold hope instead of just fear. Can I come back to visit, to see Ghost? As often as Linda and Robert will bring you, Jake promised. And when you're old enough to drive, you'll have a standing invitation. This will always be a safe place for you, Emma. Always. 6 months later, Jake stood in the same spot where Ghost had first refused to leave the barn. The white gelding grazed peacefully nearby, no longer fixated on the hidden room that had sheltered a frightened child. The barn was still standing, though Jake had abandoned his plans to demolish it. He'd instead reinforced the structure, repaired the roof, and converted the hidden room into a proper guest space with windows insulation, and a door that opened from the inside. The space where Emma had hidden now held comfortable furniture and warm lighting, transformed from a place of fear into a place of refuge. Emma visited every few weeks, each time a little more confident, a little more willing to smile without hesitation. She was thriving with Robert and Linda, attending school under her new identity, making friends, seeing a therapist who specialized in childhood trauma. Marcus Webb was awaiting trial, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Agent Santos had kept her promises, every single one. Jake's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "They're here." He walked toward the house and saw Linda's car pulling into the driveway, Emma already climbing out before it had fully stopped. She ran toward Ghost, her arms outstretched, and the white gelding nickered that same gentle sound he'd made the first time Jake had found her. The horse lowered his head to Emma's level, and she wrapped her arms around his neck, pressing her face against his white coat. Jake watched this reunion and thought about the morning Ghost had refused to move, had planted himself outside the old barn with absolute determination. Some people would call it instinct, animal intuition, lucky coincidence. But Jake knew better. Ghost had understood something that humans often forgot, that the most important thing you could do was show up for someone who needed you, even when you didn't fully understand why. That courage sometimes meant simply refusing to leave, standing guard until help arrived, being present for someone who had been alone too long. The barn stood behind them, no longer forgotten or scheduled for destruction, but honored now as the place where a frightened child had found shelter and a lonely man had found purpose, where a white horse had refused to abandon his post until the people who needed each other finally found one another, and where, against all odds and despite a system that had failed repeatedly, something like a family had begun to form. Not traditional, not what anyone would have planned, but real and strong and built on the kind of trust that only comes from facing darkness together and choosing light. Emma looked up from Ghost and smiled at Jake, a real smile full of joy and security and the beginning of peace. And Jake smiled back, knowing that sometimes the most important things in life come from the moments when we listen to the wisdom of a stubborn horse and open our hearts to the people who need us most.